There. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And we are closing in on the end of a series of classes that we've had on inequality, the curse of wealth, the trends in the 21st century that are generating huge amounts of inequality, and the difficulties they present for us as a society, whether we're thinking of that in terms of a democracy and how we have equal influence given the degree of concentrations of wealth we have, or simply how we can feel ourselves to all be in the same solidaristic society if our inequalities create real space between us, chasms of social difference. And so we started talking last week about the beginnings of the outlines of an approach to address this. And that's where I really want to focus this week, and I hope this will be more speculative than anything that we've talked about so far. I believe I've done the research that much of what we've talked about so far is well grounded in economics, that there's good research to show that the 21st century form of capitalism, a globalized, financialized, much less regulated, much more information based in our society, much less manufacturing based, that this kind of capitalism generates more inequality and is more difficult to regulate than was the 20th century form of capitalism, at least the middle of the 20th century form of capitalism. So that seems to me to be well established by people like Thomas Piketty, Branko Milanovic, the economists whose work I've been sharing with you. It also seems to me that the psychology, the sociology, the injustice of this inequality make it clear that our society suffers. And so the research that shows when we look at our economy in terms of the level of economic security or precariousness it's generating, in terms of whether or not we feel respected or denigrated at work, whether or not our jobs have the kind of benefits that allow us to actually not just take home an income, but have a secure life, a life with health insurance, with some stability in our hours and security in our capacity to sustain our job, preferably some vacation time each year, or whether our economies are securing our communities, making our communities viable, or increasingly places that the children flee from in order to find jobs elsewhere. In each of those metrics, the United States is suffering, right? And we have an economy that is not meeting the human needs of our population. Quite the contrary, is rendering many of us precarious to desperate, and therefore angry and resentful, and this is poisoning our politics in addition to undermining our sense that we live in a decent community. And so that's the consequence of this kind of economy. We looked in great detail at Thomas Piketty's work, showing that inequality has roared back in the 21st century, especially in terms of income, less so in terms of wealth. I will return to that point because I think that's a really important point. We've looked at Branko Milanovic's work that shows that in basically every developed society in the world today, capital income is going up, labor income is remaining stagnant or going down. It doesn't matter whether you're in a Scandinavian social democratic state or a more Anglophone libertarian state, and that there are features of 21st century capitalism that 20th century capitalism used to counteract, but that are not being effectively counteracted anymore, and that are all inequality producing features. So our economy, in a sense, is geared to produce more and more wealth for smaller and smaller groups, and to, in essence, redistribute up, take income away from those in the bottom 50% and redistribute it to the top 1 or 0.001%. And that this is a structural feature of our economy with predictable effects. I am going to be really quick here. I'm going to focus on children. I've shown you already that the effect in terms of all kinds of metric of social well-being, whether we're talking about life expectancy, mental health, obesity, children's test scores, rates of murder and incarceration. In all of those regards, a more unequal society is a more unhealthy society, drawing in particular on the work of Wilkinson and Pickett, but I think it's supported by robust findings in social psychology as well. Child well-being, I'm going to return to just for a moment, because I think it illustrates where I want to go with this, which is to begin the conversation about values and about shared values and about the way in which our economic discourse, our political discourse around economics seems to be increasingly devoid of values. It's all quantitative, not qualitative. It's all about growth, not about decency or well-being. And so one way to begin to anchor our conversation about economics and values is to begin to look at the people who I think we can agree are, in a sense, least undeserving among us and most vulnerable among us, and that is our children. When I say least undeserving, I guess I mean if you're the child of a poor person, that's not because you chose to be a child of a poor person. You're not responsible for your parents' decisions. You did not deserve to come into the world as a child of this family as opposed to that family. This is dumb genetic luck, social fate. And so, in a society that doesn't do anything to compensate or to protect children from severe economic vulnerability, we in essence are letting the sins of the parents fall upon the child. If you believe those are sins, right? I don't happen to believe that they're sins. I believe that there's a structural economic force at work here, but I'm trying to get to a point of value convergence. And so starting with the children seems to me to be a really good place. And as we can see, children do better in more equal societies. Child well-being is lower in more unequal societies. Children are barometers for their parents' social anxiety and stress. Unequal societies produce parents who are more likely to experience high levels of social anxiety and status stress, in addition to economic stress. And the children internalize their parents' anxiety and discomfort. And from the age of 2, 3, 4, this is interfering with their development and well-being. They don't deserve that. As a decent society, we should be concerned with all of our children, not just with my children, my child, right? And so this then brings us back to mobility. Again, one of the things we see, the higher the rate of inequality, the lower the level of economic mobility, the Great Gatsby curve. And I just want to point to one explanation I don't believe I've discussed with you yet. Part of the explanation is that the distance you have to travel to have upward mobility is larger in a more unequal society. So it's just more difficult. Another part of the explanation is that in a more unequal society, wealthy parents are more worried about their children's downward mobility. And so they spend more to protect them or insulate them from downward mobility. And that makes it harder for the children whose parents don't have those resources to compete with the children of the affluent resources in the more competitive 21st society. But one more factor I'm just going to point to because I think it's important, right? And this is building on work I've mentioned to you, but it's been a while, by Sandhil Mumatatan and Eldar Shafir, an economist and a psychologist, in their book called Scarcity. And in Scarcity, the subtitle, The New Science of Having Less and How It defines our lives, they do a lot of research on people who are experiencing economic or financial worries or stress. And what they find, the metaphor they use, is that those people have diminished mental bandwidth. And I'll ask you to put yourself in a situation that I hope you haven't faced, which is the situation where you're facing eviction, right? Your landlord has put a notice on your door. You have 1 week until the marshals or the sheriffs are going to come and move you and your family and your possessions to the street. And when you're in that situation, how do you really find the focus, the time, the energy, the bandwidth to pay attention to anything else? It dominates your consciousness, the economic stress of facing eviction. Please note that 40% of renters in America today face eviction at one point or another, that once you've been evicted once, it makes it much more likely that you're going to be evicted again. It kind of puts you into a track of housing. Ordinary landlords often won't rent to you, where they're going to be much more aggressive about enforcing delinquency on your rent. All of that to say that that becomes a source of extreme financial stress and worry. What we see is, on the one hand, that financial stress and worry has gone up for everyone, but especially for the people without a high school degree from the 1970s to the current century, to the point where nearly 50% of people without a high school degree are reporting high levels of financial stress and worry on a regular basis by the time we get into the current period. And what the work on scarcity indicates is that's going to make it much more difficult for those people to be attentive, to be supportive, to be curious and sensitive in the way in which they approach parenting. Their economic stress is going to take all of their focus and energy so that none will be left for their children. This is another, I think, dimension to diminished mobility and the way in which the children suffer more in a more unequal society. Everybody suffers in a more unequal society. We've looked at this together before. One simple way to put this is, if you believe that status anxiety is one of the most destructive things that human beings in highly developed societies suffer from, and I've tried to establish with you that there's an awful lot of evidence that, for instance, it doubles the risk of heart disease, which is the #1 killer in the developed world, that it increases the likelihood that you're going to become drug addicted or use alcohol, that you're going to have low levels of trust, high levels of obesity. If you're worried about that, then you should rather be middle class in a middle inequality society than be rich in a high inequality society. You should, if you are trying to minimize your level of status anxiety, prefer to be lower middle class in a low inequality society than to be rich in a high inequality society. And I'm not saying that we face these choices, but I am saying that we can try to steer our society from being a high inequality to being a medium or low inequality society. And if we succeed in doing that, we will make everyone better off, not just the people at the tail, the people at the bottom, but actually the people at the top will be better off as well, in terms of anxiety, in terms of comfort, in terms of belonging, in terms of self-worth. These are better societies. And so then this gets me to where we left off last week and where I really want to focus on. this week. And as I said last week, I want to focus the conversation in the first instance, not on policy, but on values. And the reason for doing this is because we are so polarized, we are so fractious, there's so much rancor in our politics that if I start having a conversation about policy, and if the policy recommendations I make appear to be associated with one party more than another, they're going to be non-starters, right? Half of the people will reject them, not on their merits, but because of what they say about my identity. You're one of those liberal Democrats. I'm not. Therefore, I'm shut down. I'm not listening to you anymore. Whereas if we start the conversation with values that are deliberately tailored to be inclusive values, non-partisan values, American values, values of justice and decency of our shared political morality, and not values or policies that seem to divide us, not wedge issues, then I think we've got a better prospect for beginning to have a civil conversation about what we can do about all of this. So that's where I'm going to start. Um, and the way I'm going to describe this is shared values of a democratic political economy. And so one way I think to express this is that in the middle of the 20th century in the United States, we got pretty close to having the kind of economy that supports our aspiration to live in a democracy. And immediately I'm going to have to qualify that and say, well, we being white European people, we being primarily men and women who were associated with white European men via marriage or via parental relations. And so this was not a fully inclusive political economy. We should aim to do better in the 21st century, but it was for many of us, and we were at the time primarily a white European society. We had a economy that led to levels of inequality that were not incompatible with democracy, that allowed us to feel greater solidarity, commonality, sympathy with each other, and that informed, supported, undergirded a kind of politics in which we could talk with each other respectfully, in which resentment and difference were not driving us apart and into kinds of political antipathy that are incompatible with hearing each other. And so I'm going to suggest in no uncertain terms that the level of polarization that we have in this country today is really incompatible with considering ourselves a full democracy, because the understanding of democracy I work from involves citizens acknowledging that there are legitimate differences on policy issues and listening to each other, learning from each other, compromising with each other, and that the level of polarization that we have right now is such that we really don't listen to each other, which means we're really not deliberating, which means we're just taking turns imposing our will on each other, or alternatively, just paralyzed when we can't impose our will on each other. And that makes us less than democratic. And so we need a certain kind of economy to get us to the point where we are more equal. To get support for reforms, we need to find ways of talking with each other that are more respectful, more open to difference, but also more generative of commonality. And so my suggestion is focusing on shared values, deliberately trying to find the values we can share. So let me go through some of these values quickly. And I'm going to start with non-domination. And I know this may sound a little arcane, a little strange, but I actually think we have a long legacy in this country of thinking that that is an important value. It's a legacy that goes back to the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. I think if you read the Declaration of Independence, in part, the complaint that it makes is that the King of England, the Parliament of England, are governing the United States by their arbitrary will and caprice, and that no equal person should be dominated in that way by another. We should be governed by laws and by the laws that are formed in a process that we all feel like we own, like we have consented to, that we have contributed to, so that the will that governs us is a will that is predictable and, broadly speaking, our own will. And this is, it seems to me, uh, perhaps the central political value of American culture. It's taken us hundreds of years to work out its implications. It's still an aspiration as opposed to something that we've secured. It's still an incomplete process. It seems to me this is characteristic of our democracy. We articulated values in the 1770s and 1780s and the 1860s and the 1870s and the 1930s and the 1940s that we're still working in the 2020s to secure. They're wonderful guideposts, regulative values. They're hard to realize. And being serious about the shared project of living in a society regulated by shared values requires us to come back to those values on a regular basis and measure our world by its aspirations, its normative regulative standards. Non-domination requires a kind of economy in which concentrations of wealth and intergenerational advantage do not foreclose the equal opportunity of each of us to participate as an equal in our political process, to have an equal opportunity to influence its outcome by voting, by engaging in discourse that contributes to public opinion formation. And when we have too much concentrated economic power, that is no longer possible. We can talk about how much money goes into an election in the contemporary American political process. It's billions of dollars. We can talk about the very small fraction of the population that provides most of the dark money, the unaccounted for money streaming into political action committees. Some findings indicate that as much as half of that money comes from 40 individuals. And please note that part of the reason that I'm not able to say with certainty that that is correct is because it's dark money, because it's hard to trace, because it doesn't show up in public reports, isn't regulated by campaign finance law. But having said that, I think we can be clear. A society in which a small portion of the population, 1%, has over a third of the wealth is a society in which there's not going to be equal influence over our political decisions. And that means that we're not going to be able to say, I'm ruled by laws that I have had a say in making. That means that in a sense, we may be dominated by others in our politics. And I want to be as clear as possible. I can't say exactly what level of equality non-domination requires. That's part of the nature of focusing on a value and not a policy, is what kind of tax right? What kind of inheritance, what kind of public education, what kind of public financing for elections, what kind of regulation of dark money follows from all of this? We're going to have to figure that out. But before we do, let's just notice that we share this value in common and that we know that our politics don't realize it right now, whether we're talking about Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Donald Trump. They all agree that our political system is rigged by the level of economic inequality, the strong concentrations of wealth that a 21st century economy has generated. Second basic value, and by the way, please feel free to pitch in whenever you want. I'll be as clear as possible. This is the most speculative part of this series of talks we've done together. I'm no longer working on the basis of research that has some empirical verifiable dimension to it. I definitely want to hear your criticisms as well as your ideas for how to go about this process of trying to rebuild. I think you could call it our public basis for justification. Right now, we're so bifurcated. Either you're on team red or team blue, never the twain shall meet. Let's start finding some values that will unite us. How are we doing with these values? How am I doing with these values? Second candidate, that we should want a society without systematic status subordination. Again, this goes back to the founding and the framers and the Constitution, the idea that we don't have lords and commoners, that we don't have unequal status under the law. This was an idea that was immediately betrayed by the Constitution's incorporation of slavery, by the different empowerment of women and men, but it was a clearly articulated aspiration. And in the 21st century, its implications are that whether your skin color is white, black, brown, otherwise, whether you're a female, a male, non binary, whether you come from a family that has a lot of education or a family that has little education, whether you come from an urban area or a rural area, should not affect your standing in this society as an equal citizen and should not affect the kind of economic opportunity you will have in this society. To do otherwise, to allow race or gender or education level or region to affect our citizenship and our opportunity is essentially to live in a society with something akin to castes. And that is, again, deeply at odds with the American experiment in creating a society where, quote, all men are created equal and endowed with certain fundamental rights, where, quote, we have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And please note the way I formulated this. Yes, race and gender are going to be heard by Republicans as being much more democratic in terms of the party that stands up for those kinds of issues. But education level and region, geographic distribution of opportunity, I hope that those might be values that might be heard to be more sympathetic to Republican concerns. And so that there's a way of showing that the kinds of issues that Democrats care about, the kinds of issues that Republicans care about in terms of our standing as equals, as citizens and persons within this economy can be traced back to a shared value that brings us together across party lines. Third value, no excessive social inequality. And as I've tried to show you, excessive inequality makes us less healthy, makes us less trusting, less cooperative. It undermines well-being and solidarity. And again, I want to be as clear as possible. Like with non-domination, I can't tell you this is the healthy range of inequality. It's only when it gets out here that it becomes unhealthy. Values can't do the work of precise determination of policy outcomes. They're a shared foundation on which we then have those debates. But I want to be as clear as possible. We need to be figuring out we're never going to be a fully equal society in which income and wealth are evenly distributed between all persons. That just doesn't work with a modern economy or a modern society. It would involve way too much state intervention in the economy to be compatible with liberty. So, as Madison said in Federalist 10, liberty combined with differences in capacity will generate differences in income and wealth. But how wide should we let those differences become? What is the non-deleterious range of inequality? And how then can we get our society there? We seem to share the idea that we don't want to live in a completely hierarchical society. So, three values. I've got two more sets of values here. One of them, and these last two, I hope are on the one hand straightforward, and on the other hand, saying them out loud maybe helps us to see how far adrift we are in an era in which we have done so little to regulate our economy. So we need good jobs, right? And to be as clear as possible, the emphasis should be on good as well as jobs. We don't just need jobs. Joe Biden has presided over a record level of job creation in our economy over the last 3+ years. How many of those jobs are jobs that not just allow people to make some money, but let's start with the negative. Don't involve denigration, humiliation, or stultification as a result of going to work. And so we want to avoid work that dehumanizes us. Let's take it up a level. How many of those jobs involve actual respect for the worker and her capacities? Allow the worker to exercise a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of creativity, a little bit of freedom, as well as clearly indicating that they've done something valuable for our society. How many of those jobs come with security, come with a regular schedule, come with benefits that allow the person to live a non-precarious life? So health insurance so that they don't get thrown into bankruptcy or eviction by an unanticipated health emergency. We don't just need jobs, we need work that respects the dignity and treats our workers as participating in a cooperative enterprise in society that is compatible with our ideas of us as citizens, right? Allows us a certain equal standing, and as caretakers, allows us to take time off when a child is sick, or to be able to be there to pick them up from the bus without losing our job. And so we are so rich, our economy is so productive. Why can't we begin to work not just on the quantity, but the quality of our jobs? And then the final value here, the sixth value, and it's kind of two squoze together. One of them, basic economic security, right? And so if we live in a society that is so wealthy, shouldn't each person be entitled to not having to live on the streets, not having to be food insecure, is the fancy word for hungry, right? And please note that 40% of children in the richest society in human history experience food insecurity at some point during the year, right? 40% of our children are not getting both the calories required for them to develop and flourish, but also the security of knowing that they're going to get their next meal and next meal and next meal, that they can take that for granted. And therefore, they can concentrate on being a kid, on playing, on building relationships, on learning. And so providing basic economic security for all of our citizens seems to me to be another core economic value that we should be able to agree on. We have to face the cancer of race and the way in which it makes this conversation more difficult to have, right? We live in a culture, a society where a large portion of our population seems to think that the people who need assistance with economic security are not deserving. And we need to have this conversation in a forthright way, that those views are inaccurate and indecent, right? And then finally, meaningful, equal opportunity in life and equal economic opportunity. The idea that we should not be prevented from having economic aspirations that allow us to become professionals, become secure, just because of who our parents are and what their resources were. Give me just one moment. Somebody walked in. I'm going to close the door to keep the noise down. So those are my candidates for the value conversation. And I want to be as clear as possible. I'm not confident that these are home runs, that these are the best values, that these would produce a consensus. But I am confident that we need to be having this conversation, right? How can we as a society look beyond our partisan divide and back to some values that we share in common? How can we use that starting place of the idea that there are certain ideas that have run through our history, and that when we narrate that history, provide our pride, our sense of normative bearings, and then use them to begin to have the conversation. We have lost track of how to regulate our economy. We've lost track of how to have a decent economy. Where do we start the conversation about resuming the project of a shared economy? So I'm going to stop just for a second, because the next place I want to go is policy, but I want to hear for a moment. As I've said, this is the most speculative part of what I'm trying to do. Can you give me any feedback? What do you think of those values? Are there other values you would want to have included? Are there things you think that I'm mentioning that are too controversial to serve as a shared basis from which to start this conversation? Anybody? Wilma, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself, right? Push this. There you go.
Well, basically, we have to figure out a way to unfreeze our politics.
Mm-hmm.
And to communicate across these lines that we're not communicating across. And until that happens, we can't fix anything.
Yeah. And I like the way you put it. I think another way of putting it is polarization is paralysis, right? As long as we're as sharply divided as we are, then we're going to elect representatives who can't work together, who can't compromise, and we're going to stay stuck. Another way to put it, I've spoken with you about Liliana Mason's work. She's the political scientist who did the surveys that showed that 20% of Americans think that people from the other party are not fully human, but more like animals, right? And so her first article on this topic was called "I Disrespectfully Agree." And what it showed was that our policy differences are not as great as our partisan differences in identity are. If you just given an idea about, for instance, tax reform and not given any partisan label to accompany it, many Americans will converge in their judgments. But if you then say, oh, by the way, that's a Democratic proposal or that's a Republican proposal, half of the people will automatically say, oh, then I don't like it, right? And so getting back to values is my suggestion for how we might do this. So yes, Wilma, I like the way you framed it, and I basically agree with what you're saying. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a hard time disagreeing with anything that you've said, except for the question of whether or not it's feasible given the doctrinaire and sort of vicious dispositions we have toward one another. There's a couple of things I've heard recently that give me some hope. I can't remember who it was, but it was about 3 months ago. I read, I think it might have been on the young philosopher Munk.
Yascha Mounk, yes.
Yascha Mounk. It was a guest columnist who said the problem is that we take sides, not positions. And I think that's fundamentally what you were saying. And as if the idea comes from a Democrat, then it's automatically no good. Or if it comes from a Republican, it's automatically no good, rather than thinking through the logic of that particular position. And then another one I read is the philosopher Berlin. Is it Isaiah Berlin?
Yeah.
Who has this notion that compromise is actually a principle, a valued principle and a principal value, and that there's no disgrace in compromise, and that we need to make a virtue out of it, rather than currently I think it's regarded politically as a vice, and that's what keeps keeps us from doing anything in Congress, is that people feel as though if they're not loyal to their side, that they're somehow not being fully American. And we've got to have just the opposite, I think, that compromise is the essence of a democracy, and getting most but not all of what you seek is that's a good place to land, not a bad place. And
yeah,
until we change the value associated with these practices, I don't know how we're going to make any progress on it. And by the way, this is not just in politics. If you look at my field of literacy, it is exactly the same problem that we talk about with respect to politics. People they won't even listen to one another, and when they have different sides on the best way of teaching young kids how to read, it's just mind-boggling. But it's the same issues.
So, and I'm just going to circle back to the two philosophers or theorists you mentioned, Yascha Mounk, whose most recent book is called The Identity Trap, right? And it's about the way in which essentially we have made all politics identity politics in the 21st century. And so if a position is identified with one party, almost automatically that becomes part of that party's identity. I think here of the fact that Donald Trump just the other day again spoke against Obamacare, right? And please note, if we look at all of the provisions of Obamacare, like the stuff that regulates pre-existing conditions or allows children to be insured through age 26, literally over 100 million people in the United States today right now are benefiting from the provisions of Obamacare. Why would you dismantle a program that has grown to be part of the structure of the provision of a basic good in our society? And I'm not saying Obamacare couldn't be approved, couldn't be tinkered with, but why eliminate it? Because it's Obamacare. right? Because it's associated with the Democrats. By the way, most Republicans given up on this, but Trump is the really distilled form of an identity politician, it seems to me. Coming back to your second philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who Munch is a relatively young contemporary theorist. Berlin was active in the second half of the 20th century, has been dead for about 15, 20 years now. But Isaiah Berlin, for instance, in the book The Crooked Timber of Humanity, sets forth this account of pluralism, which says, look, values are not harmonious. Values are not of a kind that allow us to say, these are the right values, or these are the most important values. The famous term he used was values are incommensurable with each other, right? And so we shouldn't expect everyone to be able to come together, and therefore we should be able to compromise with each other. And this is certainly a lost virtue of American politics. Now, having said that, you are, I think, rightly skeptical of my approach. I'm doing my best to identify something positive. But having said that, I will just also notice, right, and I come back to Robert Putnam's work on the upswing, how we came together a century ago and how we might come together again, right, that we were similarly polarized and divided and fractured at the beginning of the 20th century. And so as opposed to saying the degree of polarization that we face prevents us from coming together, I think the Putnam approach is to just chip, right? It's not one thing. There's no lever you can pull to unify us. But if we do little bits of work in every realm to start identifying places we can come together, we could create a kind of recursivity, a kind of momentum, a kind of self-reinforcing process in which slowly but surely we overcame the degree of identity fracture that seems to be characteristic of us in the 2020s. John, you want to talk about the Times Siena poll that came out today? I'd love to hear what you have to say. Go ahead.
Actually, I am very interested, and that's why I put it in the chat, but I wanted to talk directly to the points you were talking
Oh, good.
about up till now. I quite take your point that without people listening to each other and cooperation, particularly people listening to each other, that there's no way out of this. And that means that some people are going to have to change their minds about what they think. Comparing people like us with not necessarily Trump people, but basically the Republican conservative point of view, which of those groups is more likely to change their mind? I mean, we have to do it because they're not going to. If there's going to be compromise, it has to be liberals moving toward conservative positions, it seems to me, then hoping that the conservative reaction would be then to have more of a rational discussion, but accepting the possibility that it'll just increase their popularity and strength, and they'll figure we're all losers.
Well, and so I would point out that in many respects, liberals have been moving in the direction of conservatism for the last 50 years, right? I mean, if we look at, if you treat the Democratic Party as the main institutional force for pursuing liberal ideas in politics, the Democratic Party has until quite recently moved progressively in a conservative direction. And that might have stalled, might have reversed a little bit in the last 5 or 10 years, but certainly the Democratic Party of Joe Biden is not as liberal as the Democratic Party of Lyndon Baines Johnson or Jimmy Carter. And so some of that has already happened, but that doesn't really speak to your point. I think that the deeper question you're arguing or asking, right? So we're so entrenched in our differences. Who budges, or what's the way out of this impasse? Right. And here my beginning gambit would be, it might already be happening in ways that are hard to discern exactly where their implications will be, right? And so I'll admit that I just looked at the headline on the Times Siena poll that you referred to in the chat, right? That Trump has a small but stable lead over Biden in national polls now 9 months before our national elections. It's getting closer, right? And the fact that it's stable should be concerning as well. And that it appears that part of what is dragging Biden down is his unpopularity, that in 2020, Trump had higher negatives than Biden. And so Biden is not benefiting as much from being the new candidate, and in fact is being dragged down by having been in office for 4 years. Having said that, I think if we also look at the details, part of what we're seeing is that the reason that Trump is not trouncing Biden is because he has high negatives too, and those negatives are pulling him down with groups that he really needs to win. They're pulling him down with white suburban women who are more focused on abortion, more focused on procreative freedom, a little disturbed about what's happening in Alabama with in vitro fertilization. And so I'm going to suggest that the very high negatives of both the candidates and both the parties indicate a kind of exhaustion with our degree of polarization and with, as Wilma observed, the paralysis that it generates, right? And so it seems to me there's an opening in this circumstance for a political entrepreneur who starts trying to say, let's break out of the stalemated politics and of all the vitriol and mudslinging of the last decade. Let's because there is fatigue with this, no doubt. There's disgust with this, and so I'm not sure it's only one side or the other side has to give, as opposed to somebody has to break the mold or transcend these differences. And in part, what I'm suggesting is that one way to do this is to take things back to core values, right? To stop focusing on the policy details at first and change the discourse to say quantitative measures of economic growth have failed us. We need qualitative discussion of what we want out of our economy. That's an evaluative conversation. What are the values that should guide it? I'm not confident, and I'm certainly not identifying an avenue via which this approach could take hold. I'm just doing my best to say, if there's this impasse, how might we come out of this impasse? John, you want to come back on this?
Well, I'd actually like to turn it a little bit into the direction of practical politics, which is to say, here's a real political sciencey point. You know, the US is a presidential system. It's not a parliamentary system. If we were a parliamentary system, Biden would have been gone a long time ago.
Right.
And England is in the middle. The Conservatives are way behind in the polls, and they're in the process of dumping their prime minister. But we're more of a sort of an autocratic, I mean, a very top-down political system where everything revolves around the president. And so apparently among establishment circles in the Democratic Party, the idea that we should tell Biden to go away and elect somebody else as our nominee is, I mean, a very common expression. Many people would like it to happen, but you haven't heard anybody, Chuck Schumer or anybody saying that. They say, well, they might privately say, yeah, I can see that there's a sort of a point to that, but we can't just dismiss Biden, our great leader, and throw him in the garbage in order to elect somebody just because he's more popular. And that's because we know if we had the old days of political parties where party bosses were mostly interested in getting elected and would sacrifice anybody or any principles in order to attract a majority of the population, now we're much too proper for that, and we really have to be on the right side rather than opportunistic. So the only hope in my mind, I still think Biden could win the election, but I'm getting pretty pessimistic about it. But on the other hand, I think a lot of Republicans say, you know, Biden is the only guy that Trump could beat. A lot of Democrats say Trump is the only guy that Biden can beat. And so we're left with these two super unpopular people. And, you know, if the political parties were functioning the way they used to, somebody would have gotten to Biden and say, you know, give him make him a proposition that he can't refuse to bow out. And he could do it with great, you know, right on the eve of the convention, he could do it with great effect, I think and it would be, because he's kind of liked in a way, you know, his personality is very, very well suited for making the State of the Union address a resignation speech, a la Nixon, probably the best thing Nixon ever did. You remember that speech that he made? So that's what I think about politics today, but I'm not very optimistic about it. And I'm also, I go back to my original point, I'm sorry to go on and on, but again, what you just said, it says the same thing. If there's going to be compromise in this country, it's going to have to be still again in a conservative direction. I mean, those people are winning.
Yeah, see, I have to say, and I don't want to get too much into the current election if I can avoid it, because in a sense, let's assume, and I think there's a chance that Biden will win this election, right? So let's assume Biden wins the election. Let's assume the Democrats regain control of the House. Maybe they get really lucky and they actually retain control of the Senate, right? And I still don't think that gets us where we need to be. Our Congress, and by the way, please recognize, I do believe, and it pains me to say it, but I do believe that Donald Trump is a genuine threat to our democracy, and so that would be the best outcome given the reality of the circumstances in 2024. But having said that, I don't think that gets us the reset that we need in economic policy. Right, we are adrift. We have moved into greater and greater inequality. That inequality, one way to put this, that there's self-reinforcing loops here, right? You know, the level of social inequality, of inequality in income and wealth we have is incompatible with political inequality. The fact that we are unequal politically means that those who have more resources, more wealth, are increasingly dictating our policy, and they're dictating our policy in ways that allow them to attain still more wealth, right? So a self-reinforcing cycle. Social inequality leads to political inequality, leads to greater social inequality, leads to greater political inequality. We need to break out of that cycle. I don't think 4 more years of Joe Biden will break us out of that cycle. I am confident that 4 more years of Donald Trump will set us back in our efforts to break out of that cycle. So while I certainly prefer one of these candidates over the other, I don't think either of them really speaks to the issues that I'm talking about in talking about trying to restore an economy that has the features that democracy requires, that decency requires, that public health requires. And so I think in a sense, John, I want to say our conversations are a little bit at right angle to each other. Having said that, I'm not sure why you say, because what I would say is, in a sense, what I'm saying is, you know, neither party right now is going to do this in its current policy stance. So what we need is not one party to move closer to the other, but somebody to leapfrog the current policy impasse and start pulling things back to values. I think FDR was a transformative politician, in part because he didn't just continue to do what Democrats before him had done, but really started to change the fundamental discourse of economic policy. I'm hoping that in the next 5 to 10 years, we may find someone who does that for us. That, you see the way I'm trying to frame it, John?
Yes, I do, but I'm hoping it happens a little faster than that. You're talking for somebody who's going to come forth and transform the situation, and you just used FDR as an example. Great. Who was FDR? He was a Democratic presidential candidate and kind of a long shot. I mean, the way FDR got into power. I don't think that we would have been thinking very highly of the Democrats continuing to run Al Smith in the 1930s. Similarly, now the best chance for doing this and for breeding some kind of leadership that'll take us in a better direction is for Biden to resign. I mean, to not run. In fact, I think it's really the only possibility in anything, unless you want to talk about the next 10 or 20 years or something.
I just have to say, and when do we anticipate that Biden should do this? You said State of the Union address, right?
That'd be good.
When is the State of the Union and when is Super Tuesday?
State of the Union is in about a week.
And Super Tuesday is in about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Right? I think I got my dates right, but I'm not positive. My point is, right, that for Biden to drop out of this race a week before the majority of delegates are supposed to be assigned in competitive primaries is just a complete disaster for the process, right? And so I don't know if you saw Ezra Klein had a column on this, and then Jamie Boulay responded, right? And the idea being, you know, that Biden should free his delegates at the convention, and then we should have a brokered convention, old school style, of the kind, by the way, that got us FDR, right? And Boulay's response is, well, part of the problem is that in the 1930s through the 1950s, we considered it legitimate for the party bosses to tell us who we were going to vote for. In the 2020s, we don't. And so I think you have to raise the question. If let's say, and I don't know who your preferred Democrat is, but let's say
anybody, Jennifer Widner, but anybody would be better. Anybody who could get the nomination would be better than Biden.
Yeah, so let's say your preferred candidate comes out of a brokered convention in August, the summer, right? I just think that might be still greater increase of the likelihood that Donald Trump is the next president. Because
I don't think any Republicans believe that.
Okay, fair enough. Wilma, go ahead.
Yeah, the issue is we're talking about creating a middle ground when there is no middle ground. And how do you go about doing such a thing? I have no idea.
And I want to say, again, just very quickly, that in the 1920s, it looked like there was no middle ground, right? So this is part of what a transformative politician does, part of what not just a transformative politician, but a break, a juncture in our culture, in our society, in our economy does. And so maybe we need another Great Depression. That doesn't make me very comfortable to say that out loud, right? But you know, the idea that we need some kind of crisis to produce the disjuncture that allows for new values, new policies to get going. But go ahead, Wilma.
More and more that what's going to happen is world war. What's that?
Yeah, even worse than Great Depression.
Yeah, everyone runs for the dictator to save them from the Great War. I don't know what you said.
Yeah, but yes, we are awfully locked in right now. I take a little bit of solace from the opinion research that shows that actually our policy views are not as polarized as our identities. I take a little bit of solace from the history that shows we were in a very similar position in the 1920s, and yet in the 1930s we came together before the World War, right? You know, the World War did help then to further cement the transition to greater concern for each other, greater equality, a greater sense we're all in this together. We're fighting a war. We're making sacrifices in order to make the world a less unsafe place. But having said that, that's an awful high cost to bear, right? For a change in our domestic politics. I gotta have some hope that maybe we can do this on a different path. David, are you raising your hand?
Yes.
Go ahead.
But only one finger because it's a little point. But it strikes me that another difference is that what you got is you got Trump and a lot of other national leaders throughout the world who are, they're enacting the populism of the right. And it leans toward the benevolent dictator. This guy will do it for us. He'll make things right. And not only will the trains run on time, but we'll be better off financially and we'll feel better about ourselves. But there is, Roosevelt represented the populism of the left, right? I mean, he was a populist, but a different kind of populist, a populist who didn't say he was going to do it for people, but he was going to bring people together to do it. I think that was what he thought he was doing with his cabinet and the like. And maybe there's someone like that. I don't know who it is. I can't think of anyone right now. I think in the 90s, we thought that Bill Clinton might be that kind of a person, but he turned out not to be. But that's a possibility. But I think there is, apropos of Wilma's point, there probably, if we were a parliamentary system, what we would have is conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans forming a centrist party, and the principles that would define that party would be people who are willing to listen to one another and make compromise. And there are still Republicans and Democrats who think that that's the way that we should go. But I don't know how we would ever get them together. I just can't imagine what that would look like. But in a parliamentary system, factions could come together with that common value. I don't think it can happen in our two-party system. But
I'm curious. I'm going to go back to the beginning of what you said, that you point to Bill Clinton, but not Barack Obama. And I'll just point out that I think both Clinton and Obama, in terms of a kind of liberal charisma, were very gifted politicians who managed to bring out some of the more optimistic or hopeful dimensions of American politics to resuscitate.
I should have. That was a mistake on my part.
No. I'm not criticizing you, but let me just point out very quickly that both of them leave office to be replaced by Republicans in very close, very contested elections, right? The Bush v. Gore one has to be decided by the Supreme Court. Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote, but loses the Electoral College vote. But they don't have the transformative power that either FDR or Ronald Reagan have for their parties. And I'm going to suggest that part of the reason is because it's not enough to be a charismatic and persuasive politician. You need to be able to implement your policies, right? And neither Clinton nor Obama were able to implement sustained policy change in the way that FDR was with the New Deal, in part because, right, we're more sharply divided as a society. Our polarization paralyzes our legislature. Ultimately, you need Congress to enact legislation if you're going to change the structure of the economy. And so it seems to me we have to be careful to put too much hope in a specific president, a specific leader. This comes back to what I was saying with John a few minutes ago about even if somebody besides Biden ends up being the Democratic nominee, gets elected, how do they break the impasse, the logjam in Congress? How do we overcome the impediments to meaningful social change? I think we need to have a fundamental reorientation of our discourse around economic policy, taking it back to core values. And then the next thing I'll say, which I'm going to not be able to go with today, given the constraints of time, is we also need to be thinking about experimental policy, right? I'll just remind you that FDR described the New Deal as throwing spaghetti at the wall, right? You just see what sticks. You don't know in the depths of a depression, when the federal government has never really tried to regulate the economy before, how to do it. And I think we have to admit, in the 21st century, we may not know how to do everything we need to do. And that rather than saying, I've got the policy package for you, we need to be a little bit more humble, a little bit more modest, a little bit more open to compromise, and say, let's start experimenting with universal basic income in Oregon. Let's start experimenting with housing policy in Illinois. Let's start experimenting with healthcare reform in Massachusetts, and just let each state, each region, each municipality see if they can identify stuff that works. That's where I want to go. And I want to not just suggest experimentation, but suggest some of the stuff that we should be looking at in terms of policies that seem to be 21st century economic policies. I think that's going to have to wait, because we have used up our time and then some. Really good being with you. Thank you for the contributions. I do think this is, and I think kind of what we're running into, this is a really hard problem. How do we begin to re-regulate an economy that's been adrift for so long and that has generated so many reinforcing loops? And please note, right, that our polarization is in part bought and paid for by the people who benefit most from policy paralysis, right? And so we do have this vicious cycle, self-reinforcing, greater inequality, greater polarization, less we can do about the inequality. It's a hard problem, but I think we've got to face up to it and begin thinking about what we can do about it. More to follow. Let's see, I've got one thing in the chat from David. Yeah, okay, fair enough. We will come back to that next week. How's that? Redistribution of wealth is a good place to leave. Everybody, please take care, be well, and I will see you next Saturday. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure as always. Thank you, guys.